It's back to school time, finally, and people are excited.
I'm looking forward to see my friends and eat lunch and go to recess.
I'm most looking forward to homework and friends.
And I'm looking forward to having some time away from her.
But parents and kids we talked to also had some worries.
I'm concerned about Delta being a stronger variant and kids getting sicker.
I don't want to catch Corona or Delta.
The numbers increasing to the point where schools will have to shift again and go from fully in-person, possibly to hybrid, and possibly back to fully remote.
I'm really concerned about how they're going to be adjusting to being at school all day with mask on, and if they're going to get aggravated.
Since spring of 2020, when the coronavirus first forced the U.S. into lockdown, students have not had a normal year of school. Full-time remote school, hybrid school, some going back to in-person school only to get sent back into lockdown with new outbreaks. Kids have been through a lot. And not to mention, it's been a tough year and a half all around. Now, a lot of places are going back to in-person school with so much still in flux. Parents, kids, educators have questions. Is it safe to go back? How can we protect ourselves? And with all those school disruptions, how has that affected students' learning and how will they make up for it? What's ahead? And how can the adults in students' lives support them in facing it? This is Nova Now, your classroom to look at the science behind the headlines. I'm Alok Patel.
My name is Lindsay Marr. I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Virginia Tech, and I study viruses in the air.
An engineer who studies viruses.
It really doesn't fall within any one discipline. We would struggle to get our research published because journals would say it's either too medical or too engineering, depending on the journal.
But then came COVID-19 and everyone needed to know, how does this coronavirus spread? Is it from surfaces we touch, from droplets, or is it airborne all around us?
And so when the pandemic began, I knew that there was a very small number of researchers who had studied this question in detail, maybe 5 or so around the world. And I knew that there was a lot of inaccurate information out there.
And now Lindsay Marr is at the forefront of some very important science, studying how the virus gets passed from person to person and how we can protect ourselves from catching it. She was one of the leading voices that lobbied the World Health Organization to recognize airborne transmission of coronavirus. But back when she first got her PhD in environmental engineering, viruses were not on her radar.
My background is actually in air pollution, and I was studying emissions of particles from vehicles and other sources.
Then, 13 years ago, she had her first child. And when she put him in daycare, she often got the call all parents dread. He was sick and she needed to pick him up.
And I'd noticed that often half the kids or more would be sick at the same time. And I knew the daycare center had very good hygiene practices, lots of hand washing and surface cleaning. And given the speed at which it seemed like all the kids became sick at once, I started to wonder if the virus was transmitting through the air.
She looked into it and realized how little we actually knew about whether viruses are spread through the air versus by touching or close contact. Her engineering background actually applied to this issue.
People who have studied particulate air pollution and understand how particles move through the air and how we're exposed to them, that we can apply those same tools and knowledge and concepts to how viruses move through the air, because it's all the same physics, really.
Because Lindsay Marr wanted to understand why her child was getting sick at daycare, she can now teach us how we're going to keep our kids safe from the coronavirus in school. She's been working to get the right information to the authorities and the public.
Because initially in the US, there was a lot of emphasis on contaminated surfaces and hand washing, and really kind of overlooking or downplaying the role of the virus being in the air. People would say, oh, no, it's not airborne. It's not airborne. No, it's close contact. It's when people cough in each other's faces. But the evidence accumulated over the months. And, I think now it's pretty widely accepted.
So how actually does airborne transmission work?
When someone does cough, yes, they emit those large droplets maybe. But in addition, they're emitting hundreds or thousands of microscopic ones that we call aerosols when they're talking. And this is important because we found that transmission was occurring without symptoms. So before people were coughing, meaning they're just breathing and talking, well, you know what? They're releasing aerosols that may contain virus in them. They behave like cigarette smoke particles because they are very similar in size. You can see cigarette smoke particles because there are so many of them. And with the virus, you can't usually see those because there's far fewer. So it's like someone smoking a really tiny little cigarette.
And if you think about how cigarette smoke travels and spreads out, you can start to imagine how the tiny microscopic droplets people breathe out might be traveling all around.
If someone's smoking indoors and the room is poorly ventilated, that smoke can build up in the air and people will be exposed to it, even if they're not close to the person. But outdoors, it's rapidly dispersed because there's so much dilution from the wind and things spreading out. If you're in a place that's poorly ventilated, that means that people's exhaled breath is building up in the air. But if you will go and open up a couple of windows on opposite sides of the room so you get some cross ventilation, or you turn on a fan, some kind of heating, ventilation, or air conditioning system that brings in outdoor air, then that will help flush out the virus from that space. And also crowding matters because it means that you're closer to other people, and so you're more likely to be kind of in their respiratory plume and breathing high levels of virus compared to if you're farther away.
Knowing how the virus spreads is key to understanding how we'll protect students in school. There's a lot of variation between schools right now, not only in their physical properties, like some schools are big, some are small, some have less windows, and then obviously there's different ordinances in different states. Can you give us a scenario in which parents are like, hey, I'm not worried?
That's tough because parents like to worry, but
that's true.
I would have much less worry if I knew that the school required and enforced masks and the kids were in a classroom where they either had the windows open or they had a portable air cleaner with HEPA, high-efficiency particulate air filtration in it. Because even if you can't have good ventilation, flushing the air in that room, that filter can help remove virus from the air.
The next layer of protection is literally a layer. Masks.
Any mask is better than no mask.
Lindsay Marr says people may not believe masks protect us because they imagine they work like sieves.
You're sieving your pasta and the things that are bigger than the holes don't go through.
So people think the virus must be smaller than the holes in a mask, right?
0.1 microns in size.
That's super tiny. How is that not getting through my mask?
Yes, the virus is very small, but it's released in these respiratory droplets and aerosols that are larger. And even if all the water evaporates, there's still a lot more other stuff than the virus in there. There's salts and proteins and other things that are in our respiratory fluid. And there's way more of that than the virus. So if you have a whole virus there, it's going to be probably at least 5 times larger than the virus itself. The second thing is that masks do not work by sieving. Let's say your virus particle is flowing through that fabric. There's a number of different ways it can be trapped. So you have to kind of shrink yourself down to the size of something kind of microscopic. And imagine you are trying to weave your way through the individual fibers in the mask. The virus has too much momentum, kind of like if the car is going around a corner fast.
So the virus can't make the turn and smashes into fibers. Got it.
And another way is that if they're really small, then they have this random motion that they get that we call Brownian motion, kind of like a drunk person stumbling around, and they can actually end up crashing into these fibers and sticking and being removed that way too. So there's no question that masks work on the basis of physics.
But maybe this physics is a little too theoretical. How about some real-world evidence?
And then we've seen plenty of epidemiological evidence by now showing that masks help reduce transmission, help protect others, and help protect the wearer.
She helps us understand how masks work if all the students in a classroom wore them.
Let's assume that you have someone who's infected in those classrooms. And let's say that you have a kind of average cloth mask, about 50% efficient in reducing the amount of virus in the air. The magical thing about universal masking is that if everyone's wearing a mask, you get this multiplicative effect where the person who's sick, whatever they're releasing into the air is reduced by half. And then for the other people who are exposed, whatever they're breathing in from the air around them is also reduced by half. So you get overall a 75% reduction of what people are breathing. So if your chances of getting sick were directly correlated with the amount of virus in the air, then if everyone's wearing a mask, you've reduced that risk by 75%. That's a big assumption, but that's a starting place.
That's a lot of protection from something that's so simple a child could use it.
Young kids are pretty amenable to what we teach them. They learn how to tie their shoes. They know how to wear their underwear. You teach them how to wear a mask. And they'll wear a mask, especially if they see other people around them doing it.
And no, there's no evidence they're bad for kids. They don't interfere with breathing. And the supposed studies saying they trap carbon dioxide have been debunked. As long as your child can remove a mask unassisted, they're safe. I asked Lindsay Marr, what should we look for in a mask?
You're looking for two key factors. One is good filtration, and that depends on the mask material, what it's made out of. And the second is how well it fits. Just a simple cloth mask, I would put that in the category of good, because anything is better than nothing. Better options, which are, for example, a cloth mask that has a pocket in it where you can put a filter inside there, or better yet, has a filter built into it, and that the filter spans the entire area of the mask and is made out of surgical type mask material, or is a HEPA filter and can filter out at least 95% of particles.
You've probably heard that N95 masks are the best option, but you can't get them for kids. Lindsay Marr says the Chinese KN95s are available for kids.
And then the South Korean version, which is the KF94, those are made of really good filtering material and are made to fit tightly. And the fit is really important because if it leaks, like if you have gaps on the sides of the mask or around the nose or under the chin, it's like having giant holes in your mask.
She says schools shouldn't overspend on cleaning products and hand sanitizer. They need to put resources into ventilation.
As far as the surfaces go, I could see an argument for some extra attention to cleaning the high-touch surfaces, such as doorknobs. Beyond that, cleaning everything else with multiple times per day or shutting down the whole school for a whole day to do deep cleaning, that is definitely overboard. It is possible, of course, for the virus to transmit through touching a contaminated surface. That risk is very low. And just given the amount of virus that's in those droplets and what we know about how well they survive on different surfaces, for the amount that in real life that ends up being deposited on there, studies shown, including our own, show that there's probably just not enough there. We're sharing the air all the time, and it's much more easier, I think, to be exposed to the virus that way.
So ventilation, masks, this hopefully sounds pretty straightforward.
When we combine that with other things like maintaining a little bit of distancing and having good ventilation, that along with hygiene, of course, that we can achieve strong overall protection. But you have to combine these things.
What is your biggest concern in sending your kids back to school?
My biggest concern is lunchtime. Eating in a cafeteria is my pandemic nightmare scenario. In order to eat, you have to remove your mask. There are hundreds of kids in there together. They're seated closely together at these long tables. Everyone's trying to talk and be heard. That's kind of the worst possible situation. Crowding, close together, loud talking. You release respiratory droplets and aerosols when you talk, and the louder you talk, the more you release. That is just virus central. I envision all these smokers sitting in a room together, puffing away with 200 people and unmasked. Yeah, that's my nightmare.
So Lindsay Marsh strongly recommends lunch outdoors. If that's not possible, then maybe having kids eat in their classrooms, even opening the windows for 20 minutes during lunch will make a big difference. Staggering kids' lunch periods would help, and keeping them as short as possible. Would you send your kid to school unmasked? And if you would, what's the scenario in which you would feel comfortable doing that?
If they're vaccinated, number one, although one of my kids is not vaccinated. But even if she were not vaccinated, if cases were low, low meaning maybe less than 10 per 100,000 over 7 days. So yes, there is that scenario.
But we are very far from that scenario right now.
So with the previous variants in a school cafeteria, let's say, I could see maybe you have someone sick and maybe a handful of other people around them get sick. But with Delta, now I see everyone in there becoming infected all at once from having one or two infectious people in there. Seeing that people were becoming infected with short exposure times and the rapid rise in cases and the fact that cases are much higher now than they were 2 months ago, that all makes me more nervous than I was a couple of months ago.
Would you be in favor of postponing schools reopening?
School is really important for a kid's health and well-being. Even with an airborne virus, we know that when you employ strong layered protections, kids can be in school without having large outbreaks. So I am firmly in the camp of let's go back to school with strong precautions, including masking, including good ventilation, and thinking about how you're going to handle those higher risk situations such as lunch and doing everything you can to increase distancing and reduce crowding.
And for her musical exit, Lindsay Marr offers what's become her theme song these days.
The Police, Every Breath You Take.
So we know we can get students back to school safely. When we come back, we'll talk about how to get them back to learning and thriving despite all they've been going through. Because of the drastic changes to how students have had to attend school in the past 18 months, there's been a lot of attention on how that's affected kids' learning.
It comes as no surprise that there's been learning loss during the COVID-19 pandemic. Students learning from home, many with little or no access to technology.
Some kids are 7.5 months behind when it comes to reading, and 7 months behind in math as well. For perspective, a full school year is 9.5 months.
Students learning remotely did worse on the annual exam overall.
My senior did exceptionally well. She was on site. My junior was all virtual and did terrible.
But even experts were startled to see the results in a first-of-its-kind study to measure the learning loss, and even more shocked to see the disparities for students of color.
It's estimated from the study that for Black and brown children, that's about $80,000 of earnings loss, which is about a year or 2 years worth of income for the average Black family in New Jersey.
Researchers at the Center on Reinventing Public Education examined hundreds of studies trying to measure what they've lost. They estimated that students are behind what they would normally learn in a year by several months. Monica Bott, PhD, is the Senior Research Director for the University of Chicago Education Lab. She says we have a way to go to understand the full learning cost of the pandemic.
I also think that what we're going to see is that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Some kids actually thrived with remote learning who might not have in a traditional school system. Other students really need that in-person learning and have been very, very disconnected from school, as we can see in the data.
But even before the pandemic, there was already a lot of inequity in the system. Low-income students and students of color had less access to educational resources and opportunities. They also had more obstacles like work responsibilities or language barriers. So back in what we might fondly be thinking of as normal times, the learning gaps were already daunting.
Think about this challenge. You are a teacher. You have about 30 students in your classroom on average, where you have this very, very big spread in student learning in terms of, having kids who are at a 6th grade math level versus a college level, and your job is to teach them all. That is a heroic task if ever there was one, and yet we ask millions of teachers to do that on a daily basis.
To add another layer of inequality, the disruptions of the past year and a half have not affected everyone equally. Some kids had better access to digital tools. Some kids' home environments were more conducive to learning than others. And not surprisingly, studies have shown that with the pandemic, vulnerable students fell even farther behind. Educators have plans to get students back on track. Some started early with summer school. Others are adding extra time to the school day or days to the school year itself. Some are allowing parents to have their kids repeat a grade to give them a chance to catch up.
For kids who were already doing better prior to the pandemic, we think that they're going to have the tools to recover faster.
But programs targeting the especially vulnerable are crucial. For years, Monica Butt and the Education Lab have been gathering evidence for a promising intervention, high-dosage tutoring. Maybe you think of tutoring as paying someone after class to give you extra coaching. But high-dosage tutoring is included in the school day. Students who need help with math, for example, have daily sessions with a tutor as one of their classes. In the version the Education Lab tested with 9th and 10th graders, each tutor worked with 2 students at a time. Tutors could work out exactly where students' problem areas were, coordinate with their teachers, and target help to the level they needed.
Students learned 2 to 3 times as much as their peers who did not participate. That is enormous.
Monica Butt thinks our current challenges demand we think more boldly about new ways to address the gaps in education.
That kind of innovation and idea generation, even though I know people are very tired right now, is going to be really important.
With this drive to get students caught up, it's going to be a busy year. I mean, coming back to school is stressful in any year. But students have already dealt with so much. To prepare them for what's ahead, we need to take that into account when we consider what's made learning so difficult.
When you encounter a stressor, it narrows your cognition to focus on that stressor at hand, which means you're not likely to be able to focus on that algebra problem.
That's Emma Adam, PhD, a developmental psychobiologist at Northwestern University, who studies the effects of stress on adolescents and young adults.
I study both the perceptions of stress, the kinds of things that cause stress in adolescents, and also the implications of stress for their bodies and brains and their long-term health and well-being.
Justin Janison, a parent who is also a school counselor, has seen firsthand how some kids have been affected.
I work with kids grades kindergarten to 5th grade, and the kids that I knew had mental health struggles before continue to struggle, and some of them much more during the pandemic. And I think even more alarming were the kids that were not on my radar, who had never had any kind of mental health struggles prior to the pandemic, but then started to present with some of those different things that their families and caregivers were really concerned about.
Emma Adam helps us understand how stress works. I think the average person, especially after the past year and a half, has their own definition of stress and how it's affected them. But how does a scientist like you define stress, and how do you measure and study it?
By definition, it involves both a perception of a stressor in your environment, of something challenging, but also it involves the biological changes that occur that are part and parcel of the stress response. So your heart rate goes up, your cortisol levels rise. There's a bunch of changes that happen in the body to kind of give you the energy to face the demands of the day. That's the good part of stress. But if you have too high demands and not enough coping resources to meet those demands, those changes in your body that occur can actually then become harmful over the long term.
Can you separate the types of stress that are considered bad versus the types of stress that you're like, hey, that's normal, that's the normal human being roller coaster?
The problematic types of stress include things like trauma. You have a major threat to the self, either your body or your psyche, threat of injury, threat of harm, and then chronic stress. So these systems in our bodies are intended to respond and then recover, respond and then recover. And so if you're in stress activation mode all the time, you don't have any chance to recover. Some of the healing and restorative aspects of the body are put on hold.
That means that the chronic stress of dealing with the pandemic for all these months can take a toll.
And so you can imagine putting those kind of responses on hold for a long time is problematic for health and also for cognition.
Emma Adam collects data for long periods that allow her to track the relationships between experiences and stress reactions over time.
The general methods that I use in my research are diary studies. So I recruit adolescents, and then they fill out sometimes daily diaries, sometimes diaries multiple points of the day, where they're reporting on where they are, who they're with, what they're feeling, what they're thinking, and the stressors that they encountered and how stressful they were.
The diaries are typically gathered through an online survey sent out by text or email. They get asked about different sources of stress, from homework to romance.
In addition to doing reporting on those diaries, typically adolescents then give me a small sample of saliva or spit, giving me the title of the spit queen around Northwestern.
That's right. Your spit can say a lot about your stress level.
In that spit, we can measure cortisol, which is a stress hormone. I also measure sleep using like Fitbits on steroids.
So those take fine measurements of physical activity. When the pandemic hit, they had to stop the parts of the study involving personal contact, including all that great spit collecting. But they still had the diary reports.
The good thing was we were already in the field with adolescents measuring their stress levels.
They quickly shifted to measuring the impact of the pandemic on adolescent stress. Unlike studies that started in response to the crisis, their study had a baseline of data from before COVID struck. While they analyzed the latest data, Emma Adam can talk about results from data collected from the end of March through July of 2020.
We actually found some surprising results. There was a little bit of relief for some adolescents and reduction in school-related stress in terms of school schedule pressure when schools were closed and they moved to online learning. But however, there were increases in a bunch of other types of stress. For everybody, there were increases in loneliness, which we shouldn't find surprising. In another study, actually, that the American Psychological Association fielded in August of 2020, the really most notable stressor was the actual uncertainty about the school year. So one thing that our bodies and brains really don't like is not being able to predict our environments. That lack of being able to plan for the upcoming school year or lack of ability to plan for their future were some of the largest stressors that youth, especially college-age young adults, were reporting.
But some were worse off than others.
There were disparities by parent education level in terms of the impacts of the pandemic, with much worse impacts on stress and mood for youth from lower and actually moderate education families, and also one of the reasons that we might be seeing increases in depression. And again, that is likely to be borne unequally by different socioeconomic groups and different racial groups, given that there's been more deaths in individuals of color, and there's been more death in lower income groups. The parents and the families are just encountering more stress. They're in the jobs that are, as frontline workers, they're more likely to get exposed to COVID as a result. They are more likely to have encountered job loss, and they are more likely to have a challenge with working at home.
Her previous research has also pointed to an important source of stress.
The other thing that really stood out in my research in terms of predicting biological stress was experiences of racial discrimination.
The pandemic brought on a rise in anti-Asian hate. In its first summer, incidents of Black people dying at the hands of the police also dominated the headlines. Emma Adams' team is currently analyzing how these may have caused additional stress for young people.
So we see these differences in stress exposure and stress biology as a probably an understudied pathway explaining some of the disparities in health and educational outcomes.
And they're looking for ways to interrupt that pathway.
We're engaged in a racial ethnic identity promotion intervention designed by Adriana Umania-Taylor at Harvard, where we're having group discussions about race, about discrimination, about identity and the meaning of identity. And it turns out that having a strong ethnic identity helps to buffer you from the stresses of discrimination and race-related stress.
One of the most effective ways to reduce the damaging effects of stress on the mind and body for anyone is to improve sleep.
because your body expects a certain sleep-wake cycle. Being consistent, giving that predictability to your body helps you sleep well, and that really has positive effects both on mental health and physical health and academic outcomes. There's a whole bunch of sleep hygiene tips that you can find on the internet, but I really want to emphasize that anything that increases your feelings of safety, security, regularity, predictability is good for sleep. And so for younger kids, a bedtime routine involving parents who give you that sense of safety and security is really helpful.
As we now reopen schools, and we have all these kids going back now to in-person learning, what potential stressors are you worried about?
One problem is that we've been getting very used to social isolation and have less recent practice with entering social situations. And that can be really scary and create anxiety. Just as we found there was kind of a bit of a relief from that social stress at the beginning of the pandemic, I'm worried about increases in anxiety in kids as they re-enter the school situation, and particularly for kids that might be prone to social anxiety.
That's a concern for Angelica, a parent who spoke with us.
I have 2 children. My oldest is Gabriel. He's 10 years old and he's autistic. He also has social anxiety and he has a service dog to support him with his needs. He had a huge development with his social emotional this year's remote learning because of the pandemic. I was able to be by their side and break down the social emotional situations they have at school. I'm hoping they're able to replicate that at school.
Emma Adam continues.
The other worry is that for a lot of kids, the schools, they're starting in person 100% right away. I would actually want a slower transition back to in-person learning with perhaps a hybrid model for a little bit, just so that the shock of those social transitions unfolds a little more slowly. The other thing that's happening is that kids and adolescents are going back to early school start times, something that's going to eat into sleep time.
Okay, so how can parents help?
Do their best to try to give guidance regarding bedtimes and wake times and convey how important it is to get sufficient and regular sleep schedule. And then the other thing parents can do is be on the lookout for signs of depression and anxiety. You know, everybody's going to have a bit of the jitters, but you know, if your child isn't eating, if your child is losing weight or gaining weight rapidly, if their mood seems much more subdued than usual over a longer period of time, these are maybe signs that clinical intervention is required.
But Emma Adam has also found reasons for hope.
We might be going back as we emerge, hopefully at some point from this pandemic, to a slightly kinder, more empathetic society, because so many people have experienced stress, loneliness, and depression during this pandemic. There's been a bit of a sea change in terms of acceptance of mental health issues. One thing we did notice in the low to moderate education group of adolescents is with the pandemic came an increase in caring. And so I'm hoping that as kids get back to school, what they'll experience is a kinder environment, both in terms of how their peers treat them and also in terms of how teachers treat them and the administrations.
Nova Now is a production of GBH and PRX. It's produced by Terrence Bernardo, Ari Daniel, Jocelyn Gonzalez, Isabel Hibbard, Sandra Lopez Monsalve, and Rosalind Tordesillas. Julia Court and Chris Schmidt are the co-executive producers of Nova. Suki Bennett is senior digital editor. Christina Manin is associate researcher. Robin Kasmer is science editor. And Devin Robbins is managing producer of podcasts at GBH. Special thanks to Keka, Isabella, Catherine, Justin, and Angelica, whom you heard at the top of the show, and all who shared their thoughts with us about going back to school. Our theme music is by the DJ who takes everyone to school in turntablism. That's DJ Kid Koala. I'm Alok Patel. We'll be back in 2 weeks. That's more than enough time for you to read up on various ways schools are keeping kids safe. From mask and vaccine mandates to ventilation strategies to staggered classes to outdoor lunch periods to random screening and testing and more. If you're interested in learning more about the science behind kids and parenting, check out the YouTube channel Parentalogic. It's hosted by me and comedian and mom Bethany Van Delft. We explore everything from tantrums to vaccinations. That's Parentalogic, Parentalogic. Check out our show notes for a link. Brought to you by Nova and PBS Digital Studios.
GBH.